I'm making a short video right now. It won't be very long because I don't have too much time. But sometimes I need to write down or kind of think something through when I have an idea. So I've been thinking a lot about eliminative materialism as propounded by Patricia Churchland, originally, of course. And the specific aspects of that theory that people talk about, or the most debated, is the notion of propositional beliefs and desires. Okay, now desires might be sort of another aspect of propositional beliefs. Now, eliminating materialism, of course, and you can Google it, basically says that folk psychology theories is sort of a back-of-the-envelope, sort of coarse-grained explanation of behavior, but from a neurological standpoint, it doesn't really correlate to what's going on neurologically in the brain. Example being Newton's theory of gravity was a pretty good back-of-the-envelope guess, but it wasn't as exact as it needed to be, and for example, it missed the orbit of Mercury. It was wrong about that. And so you had to get a more fine-grained, precise theory of gravity, which basically included what happens under acceleration, and how the force of gravity impacts in conditions of acceleration, and that, of course, is relativity. I'm not making a video about that right now, but basically, relativity is essentially the same as Newton, except it sort of updates or brings into account acceleration and sort of refines it. Okay, so eliminating materialism basically says that folk psychology is sort of like Newton's theory of gravity. It's pretty good in a lot of situations, but it needs refinement because it doesn't really map back to the brain. So, for example, it would say that there's no real one part of the brain that is responsible for, quote, desires or, quote, beliefs. That the folk psychology definition or notion of Ehrmark's desire or Ehrmark's belief have to be sort of updated or improved in some way to make it match what's really going on neurologically. And there's a slight gap or difference between that and pure reductionism, because if I'm reductionist about propositional beliefs, then I'll say that, well, there's some part of the neocortex, some identifiable part of the brain whose job it is to create propositional beliefs, right? So I reduce the notion of me as a subject, as a speaking hominid subject, having propositional beliefs to a particular part of the neocortex. That's reductionist. Now, eliminative materialism says, well, yes, I mean, the brain is responsible for things. It doesn't sort of posit ectoplasms or other types of sort of pre-scientific notions as being responsible for mental phenomenon. But it basically says that it's not enough to just say, oh, a belief in, say, a certain proposition reduces down to the brain or one part of the brain. It's rather goes further than that to say that the conventional folk psychology notion of a propositional belief is inadequate or needs to be changed. Now, this has a lot of controversy because it goes against instinct, because folk psychology, we're not talking about just Sigmund Freud or traditional psychology. We're talking about it's a word folk would imply just our natural common sense notions of how things work. So if I see somebody going to the refrigerator, I can infer that they're hungry or whatever. So right, they're being hungry led them to go to the refrigerator. So the notion of common sense desires, that's a very common notion. And also propositional beliefs. Now, I think a very basic propositional belief, maybe almost the original one or very early on, probably an evolutionary time period, probably before even when we were monkeys, probably we were like whatever came before the monkeys, mice or whatever, is the notion of persistence of objects. That means if a rock that I'm sitting on it now, I have reason to suspect or reason to believe that that rock will still be there the next day, right? Things don't just appear and disappear. It's a persistence of objects. And babies learn this very early on. And I think it's probably hardwired that when we have material objects, things that we can see and feel and touch, we believe them to be persistent. We believe that, that they're not going anywhere. So beliefs and desires, those are pretty ingrained, and our understanding of what beliefs and desires are pretty ingrained. So it's difficult to say, well, these definitions need to change with neuroscience, as eliminated materialism would have. But then it struck me that really what we talk about when we're talking about really both beliefs and desires is essentially making predictions. That when I, quote, believe something, I'm basically making a prediction. And even desires is a little bit of a second order thing. It's not quite as easy a reach, but I could say that desires relate to the difference between predictions and the outcome. And sort of what in neural networks are called error correction. That, if I make a prediction, that the stock market is going to go up to 40,000 tomorrow and it only goes up to 37,000 just to make up numbers, then that error is about 3,000. So I need to kind of tweak my network parameters to get a better answer next time. And so, philosophers talk about desire, suffering. I mean, how do I say this? Motivational speaker people like Tony Robbins like to say that suffering is a difference between outcomes and desires, right? If we desire something and we don't have the outcome that we desire, then that creates suffering. We're frustrated by that. So we either kind of reduce our desires down to whatever the outcome is, or in some cases we try to change the outcome to match the desires. And sometimes a combination thereof, right? So somehow we're trying to adjust our desires to fit the outcomes. Okay, and that's very similar to error correction and making predictions, right? I'm not gonna, I don't have time to get into a deep dive of how machine learning works, but there's a process called error correction that where you make a prediction, you measure how far the prediction was from the actual outcome, and then you kind of tweak your parameters to try to get closer to that outcome. So desires in some way aren't too far away from making predictions and kind of error correction, error handling, refinement of those predictions. Maybe not error correction is not the right word, but the refining of those predictions. And beliefs are pretty close to the predictions themselves. Okay, so again, persistence of objects is very early belief, probably in evolution. It's probably one of the first beliefs we ever had was persistence of objects. Well, what am I saying when I say I believe that chair will be there tomorrow? Well, that's a belief. That's a propositional belief, but it's also I'm making a prediction, right? So propositional beliefs are also predictions. And even if they're about the past, it still is a prediction because I'm updating my mental model of the past, okay? So if I learn that Washington crossed the Delaware River, I mean, that's not a prediction about the future, but it is in a certain sense a prediction because I have a mental model of George Washington and I'm updating it with that information that he crossed the Delaware River. So any future information or discussion I have about George Washington will include that variable, that additional fact of him crossing the Delaware River. So my future thinking about George Washington will forever be impacted by my knowledge of the fact that he crossed the Delaware River, okay? Maybe a more real-life example. A few years ago, I don't know where, but I read that there's never really a United Kingdom era in Israel history, okay? So you have the Kingdom of Israel in the north and Kingdom of Judah in the south, and they're like separate kingdoms. And in the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, in the book of Samuel, the prophet Samuel, they talk about the kingdoms being united and then that they break apart and stuff like that. And modern scholarship basically says that yes, there was a kingdom of Judah, yes, there was a northern kingdom, but there's no evidence that they were ever the same kingdom. That's mostly mythological. And some of these books about those early time periods, the book of Samuel, the book of Kings, was written most likely during the Persian time period a few hundred years later, and the Persians probably had, let's call it, right of censorship on it. And so, a lot of this was being I guess, written with the permissions of the Persians, which is kind of a separate conversation. But the point is, not everything in there is meant to be taken historically literally. Okay, and that's a whole separate thing. But the point is, I didn't always know that. I only recently learned that actually a lot of people today think that there was never a united kingdom period of Israel, that it was always those two separate kingdoms. Now that explains a lot of the behavior later on. It makes predictions, if you will, about how I think about those two kingdoms, because there was a lot of animosity, right? There's, that's a whole separate thing, and I'm not an expert, but there was fighting, there was, kind of rivalries, as you would expect, between two neighboring tribes in that time period in that part of the world. Okay, so the fact that really Judah and Israel were always separated, even though they shared culture, they shared, similar stories, like the Abraham motif was in both cultures and things like that. They had a lot of overlap, of course, but politically they're separate. Okay, so culturally, yeah, it was basically the same culture, same language, a lot of the same religions. The Yud-He Vav-He group was largely in the kingdom of Judah, but maybe a little bit in the northern kingdom too, etc., etc., etc. But nevertheless, politically, they were separate entities, and that predicts, or that shows how there's a lot of animosity in those groups. Okay, so my knowledge that there's no United Kingdom period makes a prediction of how I think about those two kingdoms in the future of when I think about it, right? I mean, obviously this is in the past, but it's still making a prediction about my future thinking about this thing. So Washington crosses the Delaware, or whatever. So a belief about the past still is a prediction in the sense that I'm making a prediction about the future. Okay, and then in desires, again, I'll give a simple a mini lecture on something called simulated annealing. Okay, so simulated annealing is when I'm trying to find a solution. I'm generating a solution randomly. So say it's a traveling salesman problem. I have 5 salesmen, and I have 50 jobs to do, and how do I assign the salesman to the 50 visits that they have to go door-to-door salesman in the correct route, so they have shortest distance, or at least shorter distances, and etc. So I'm trying to load balance the jobs that these salesmen have to do in a way that sort of minimizes their driving time. Okay, it's very hard for computers to do. So I randomly generate these things, but I kind of know geometrically what are good routes and what are not good routes. Good routes don't have crossovers and stuff like that. Like I start at the furthest house from where my starting point is, and I work my way in. That's a pretty good route. I'm not kind of going back and forth all day, right? I just started the furthest route out, and then I go the second furthest, and the next, and the next, and I finally come back to where I started from, right? So not to deep dive it, but I kind of know generally what a nice solution to this is. So simulated annealing, I generate random solutions, and I compare it to, I don't know what the exact solution is. That's why I'm randomly generating solutions, but I know let's call it the cost of a good solution. So I say, okay, I want the good solution to cost no more than, just make up a number, $10,000. I'm just purely made up number. And a good solution will be at least close to $10,000, maybe $11,000, maybe $12,000. And so I generate solutions, and they cost me like $100,000, $90,000, and I kind of randomly keep generating them. Now, how simulating annealing works is I have a parameter called temperature, which is basically a measure of randomness. So I start at a high level of randomness, how I randomize the solutions. I'm not going to get into all the details, but basically I start at a certain level of randomness, otherwise called temperature, and I generate random solutions. And I kind of save the best one, and then I lower the level of randomness, and then I keep and generate more, and then I compare my previous good solution to the next good solution, and whichever is the better solution, I keep that. And so I keep doing this, lowering the level of randomness, and as I go, generating solutions at each level of randomness, so to speak, until I get a solution that's close to my $10,000 cost. Okay, that's a very quick thing, but I'm getting to a point. In simulated annealing, there's something called a Metropolis-Hastings algorithm. And that means that sometimes, say, my previous level of randomness, I created a solution that cost $90,000. And then in my next lower level of randomness, I have a solution that costs $80,000. So most of the time, I'm going to keep the $80,000 solution. I'm going to throw out the $90,000 solution. But the Metropolis-Hastings algorithm says, with a small probability, like say, a tiny percent of the time, I'm going to keep the higher level solution, and I'm going to retain the lower level solution, right? There's a small percentage that I might keep the worst solution. And why would I ever want to keep the worst solution? I want to keep the worst solution because sometimes if I'm tweaking my parameters, I don't sort of tweak them enough, and so I get like what's called a local minimum. Like, it's a pretty good solution, but it won't ever, for reasons that are outside the scope of this video, they won't ever come down to really an optimal solution. So they might get stuck in a solution that costs me $20,000 when the real solution I want to get to is $10,000, right? So to try to get around this local minimum issue, I occasionally pick, in a given cycle of the iteration, I pick the worst one because that gives me sort of a better chance of exploring more of the solution space. Okay, so going back to the notion of desires is a little bit like this, that desires is sort of the gap between what I have and what I want, right? The solution that I'm generating and the cost that I'm trying to get to. And most of the time I might sort of reduce, lower my expectations or something like that, to try to get closer to the answer. But every now and again I might say, I'm not going to lower my expectations, I'm going to raise my expectations. So the Metropolis algorithm, you keep the worst candidate of a given iteration, not the better candidate of a given iteration, to sort of have a short-term loss but a longer-term gain. Okay, so I mean, it's maybe not an exact analogy, just something that came into my head, but the point is, beliefs and desires are pretty closely related. Okay, I believe that having the object of my desire will better me in some way. Okay, and so I work towards achieving the object of desire due to my belief that having that will better me in some way, etc. Right? So desires are really a subset of beliefs, or a type of beliefs, right? And I may or may not get that object of desire, and then again, I either reduce my level of desire, or I increase my efforts. And so the whole discussion of simulated annealing was a little bit of a rabbit trail, but just kind of an analogy, not to be taken super literally. But again, there's a very real sense, and what I'm trying to get to here is desires are a subset of belief. They're a type of belief. And furthermore, beliefs themselves are types of predictions. So if we Venn diagram this, if desires are subsets of beliefs, i.e. all desires are also beliefs, and furthermore, beliefs are also subsets of predictions, i.e. all beliefs are also predictions, that means all desires also are also predictions, right? If Aristotle is a man and man are mortal, then Aristotle is also mortal, right? So both beliefs and desires, everything that is a desire is also a belief, and anything that is a desire and a belief is also a prediction, okay? So basically, things we call colloquially in folk psychology beliefs and desires are really just souped up predictions. And that's what neural networks do, is they make predictions. Whether it's about the past or whether it's about the future, it doesn't matter. So eliminating materialism may well be on the right track in terms of saying we need to eliminate, and that's not really the right word. I think Patricia Churchland said she didn't really want that word originally because that word was already out there and they just needed a word and they used the word. And she said it's a little bit misleading. They're not trying to eliminate folk psychology, but they are trying to say that folk psychology needs to be modified, right? Newton's gravity doesn't get eliminated, but it just gets improved upon by general relativity, right? Because general relativity replaces Newton's gravity, but it makes a lot of the same predictions. It's just in corner cases where it's different. So it might be the case that folk psychology still works in most cases, but just in the corner cases, Newton's gravity, the folk psychology has to be changed in the corner cases. So I think eliminating materialism is right, that beliefs and desires, folk psychology notion, they will have to be updated, not necessarily eliminated, but when we're talking about what that looks like in the brain, there may well be no part of the brain that's responsible for beliefs or responsible for the desires. The beliefs and desires are all just parts of predictions. Desires All desires are a type of belief, and all types of beliefs are also predictions. So therefore, all desires and beliefs are all predictions, and that's what neural networks do, is they make predictions. Ergo, eliminated materialism is right about needing to modify the folk psychology notion of beliefs and predictions. Thank you.